we're in the process of a reverse globalization. And with reverse globalization happening, now you've got to ask yourself what the financial markets, which are conditioned for maximum globalization, what they're going to look like in 6 months, a year, whatever. I mean, we're watching, commodity markets around the world, and commodity futures markets around the world just blow up and stop trading, and commodities traders going bankrupt, and all sorts of weird things are happening. But what's happening, and this is all stemming from what's the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Now, depending on who you read, and depending on the amount of dis and malinformation that you ingest, Russia's everywhere from having 40% of the Ukrainian territory locked up to barely having been able to make it across the border in Kharkov in the north, and they haven't made any ground in the Donbass. And it's like, I think the reality is somewhere between the two, right? So I'm always willing to hey, here's a really bad map, and here's a really bad map, and one is overly positive and the other one's overly negative, and you bracket between them, and you realize that as long as there's no Ukrainian planes flying, which there aren't, okay, as long as you don't see any columns of Ukrainian tanks reinforcing various lines of contact, which you don't. Facts on the ground for the Russians are they've put 200,000 troops into Ukraine at most, and they are very assiduously and judiciously achieving their operational objectives. Now, have they achieved them all? No. Have they run into problems in outside of Kiev and in Kharkov and whatnot? Absolutely. Was the northern campaign the most important part of their campaign? Absolutely not. So this is something that I chat with my partner Dexter White about all the time, and he has a different perspective on this than I do. So we kind of hash it out and trying to figure out where we are and bracket for the mismal and disinformation that's out there about what's going on. From the 30,000 foot level, it's very clear that Ukraine will not be allowed to surrender, regardless of the facts on the ground, because the United States absolutely wants to set up and create a new kind of Al-Qaeda style insurgency that we created in Syria, based out of, there it was based out of Turkey. Now it would be based out of Poland. Whitney Webb did a great article on this the other day. If you haven't seen it, I linked to it in one of my recent blog posts, so you can find it. But I absolutely recommend you read Whitney's work on our setting up a new Al-Qaeda in Poland. The Poles, by the way, are not happy about this. Okay. At least the Polish government isn't. And what I see happening from a government level here in the United States is that the Biden junta, and I refuse to call them anything less than that, who are all dirty in Ukraine and are all the architects of this war, going all the way back to the overthrowing of Yanukovych in 2014, Victoria Nuland, Gregory Pyatt, Antony Blinken, all these people were involved. Joe Biden, they were all absolutely involved in this, and they're all absolutely up to their eyeballs in this. And ideologically, they still believe that they can win. And so they really do believe that they can bind the Russians down into a kind of Afghanistan-style quagmire for 20 years. Dude, it's not going to last 20 months. Hell, it might not last 20 weeks. Because the reality is that the Poles are not interested in hosting this kind of insurgency at this moment in time. They're not interested in sending planes over. Blinken, our Secretary of State, keeps saying these random things about what kind of insurgency we're going to set up and what kind of defense we're going to create for the Ukrainian people centered out of Poland. And then the Polish government comes back and goes, no, that's fake news. We didn't agree to that. We're not sending planes into Ukraine. We're not sending armor into Ukraine. We're not doing any of that stuff. So it seems to me at this point that Blinken, whose hands are absolutely as bloody and dirty as possible in Ukraine going back 8 years, is actually acting rogue, because you never see, what I've noticed is you never see him make those statements and then the Pentagon back them up. What you hear is Biden's going to approve, through executive order, new spending to send aid to Ukraine. Okay, what aid? The Ukrainians use all Russian military hardware. The only thing you can send in is old broken down tanks and planes from Poland and Romania, from the former Warsaw Pact countries, into Ukraine. Like, you can't get the Ukrainian army and air force, which by the way is now non-existent, to start flying F-16s. No, these guys, we send the guys in with man pads and and Toyota pickup trucks with, chain guns on them. And they're going to do the same thing that they did. They're going to try and do that in Ukraine against the Russian army. And that's just dumb, but that's what they've got. And they really do think that they can make that work. And the truth of the matter is that the Russians are going to continue to enforce facts on the ground, even if it takes them longer than they originally expected. And even if it costs Putin a little bit of, cachet at home. And even if there's a little bit of infighting amongst the political and economic elite in Russia, they all really kind of understand, because I've spoken to a number of people who have contacts within Russia, and I have patrons who monitor Russian media in Russian language and can speak Russian. And they're all telling me the same thing, which is the Russian people, for the most part, are very much united in dealing with this, because they see this as a war that they were forced into by the West. And they understand the narrative that they were, poked and prodded into finally, going to war with Ukraine, because the West refused to, treat them with any degree of respect. And, this has been, and they understand, historically speaking, that this has been Western policy going back to the middle of the 19th century. So that's the way things are.